broken pieces. Mm. 2 minutes early, so I'll wait. Hey, Peter. 2 minutes. Thank you. It's really too bad that the Three Stooges never had this kind of setup to work with. They could have really just. I mean, can you imagine?
Sometimes it seems like they did choreograph it.
Yeah, yeah. The first time Claire ever saw the Three Stooges was at Bardor Rinpoche's house, and she was 3 years old or something. So she thought that it was a Buddhist thing because she saw it at Rinpoche's house. And so at the age of 3, she called them the Three Stupid Buddhas. And only later did she realize that it wasn't that you could see it elsewhere, that it wasn't just something unique to Bardor Rinpoche's house. And I said, well, what made you think that? She said, well, we saw it there, and then one of them was bald. All right, I guess it is time. Tenor gon lai jai den me badang ten den don don jen be gom jen la nyen go re shen ba me ba jen jen lo gom jen go wo zom ba shen meng a der go jen be la ma la jon do zor wa den be gom jen la Jemen mungu jewa jen jalo ying me gom jing zomba shin kanjaran dombe ngowo zomade majun denga jombe gom jela jalo don rawa jen jelo nam dong wo jogo zomba jen Jiamayin Jiryan Jarmala Mangaruban Jarwe Gom Jela Korande Yermen Domba Jela Jewan Gondo Yanda Lama Meijun Jambala Long Jing Sadalam Jiyande Razone Noje Jange Gobang Nyorando Sanje Judan Zoje Jonam Lai Janjo Bardo Dan Zoje Daige Jenzo Jembe Zunam Jendrola Benje Sanje Roma Jo Sanje Judan Zoje Jonam Lai Janjo Bardo Dane Gyamtso Daige Jenzo Jembe Sunam Jendrola Benje Sanje Roma Jo Sanje Judan Zoje Jonam Lai Janjo Bardo Gyamtso Daige Jenzo Jembe Sunam Rola Benje Sanje Romba Jo Semjen Tamje Dewa Don Deve Jodan Dambar Judge Dungara Don Dungara Je Jodan Rawara Judge Dungara Mebe Dewa Damba Dam Rawa Judge Nyering Jada Nyadan Rave Donyam Jambola Neba Joje Semjen Tamje Dewa Don Deve Jud Joje Dungal Don Dungal Je Jodan Rawara Joje Dungal Mebe Dewa Damba Don Medawa Judge Nyeren Jada Nyadon Rave Donyam Jambola Neba Semjen Damje Dewa Don Deve Judan Dembara George Dungala Don Dungal Je Jodan Drawara George Dungal Mebe Dewa Damba Don Medawara George Nyering Jadan Yedan Dra Jambala Neba George Dada Zemjan Damjelo Juzo Drawara Jinja Lamdozo Jalamda Drawara Jinja Lamdozo Lamdroma Zawar Jinja Lamdozo Dromba Yeshe Jalwara Jinja Lamdozo Dada Zemjan Tamjelo Juzo Drawara Jinja Lamdozo Jalamda Drawara Jinja Lamdozo Lamdromba Zawara Jinja Lamdozo Tromba Yeshe Jalwara Jinja Lamdozo Dada Zemjan Damjelo Juzo Drawara Jinja Lamdozo Drawara Jinja Lamdozo Lamdromba Zawara Jinja Lamdozo Dromba Yeshe Jawara Jinja Lamdozo Moje Nyunje Noi Jon Zombe Mage Zara Dombo La Yazen Jonge Zarva Sindham Balahum Ahrema Harinis Ranzare Zindarim Rimzan Guru Gandra Zonje Good morning, everyone. Today, this morning, we're going to look at the completion stage. And in that context, we will also look a little bit at why, for at least some kinds of completion stage practice, the generation stage must be mastered first. Incidentally, this is why, and this is relevant to your question yesterday, why you get sort of conflicting answers to the question, must the generation stage be perfected or mastered before the completion stage is practiced? I think that when we go through it this morning, that you'll see why you would get different answers to that question. Remember that Vajrayana Buddhism closely follows the Talmud. And in the Talmud it said that if you ask 12 rabbis one question, you'll get at least 13 answers. Actually, it's not completely a joke, because we do have the same scholarly tradition of accepting disagreement that you find in scholarly Judaism, and which is, I think, a very, very good thing. The view of the completion stage is the view that everything is lucidity, emptiness. For a practitioner of the second empowerment, bliss, emptiness for a practitioner of the third empowerment, and awareness, emptiness for a practitioner of the fourth empowerment. Generally speaking, in the especially in our tradition of the Vajrayana, we talk about the four paths. So in the prayer that we just said, grant your blessing that I traverse the four paths. The four paths are those referred to in the stages of the path that Lama Tratop is teaching. The path of the vase empowerment is the path of appearance emptiness. The path of the secret empowerment, the path of lucidity emptiness. The path of the third empowerment, the knowledge wisdom empowerment, the path of bliss emptiness, and the path of the fourth empowerment, the precious word empowerment, awareness emptiness. Now, it should be obvious that awareness emptiness, appearance emptiness, lucidity emptiness, bliss emptiness all have one thing in common, which is emptiness. So any of these four paths can, if practiced properly, lead to complete realization. For that to be true of the generation stage, however, it must be practiced, as came up during your question and your question, as a unified with the completion stage. And so the reason I feel necessary to mention that is that sometimes in theoretical, more scholarly presentations of the Vajrayana, they make it sound as though the generation stage is practically useless or worthless, not important for dummies who can't really practice the completion stage. The generation stage is for like losers, kind of. They make it sound that way, and that's not really true. If that were true, great masters would not continue to practice it. And that's why I want to precede a discussion of the completion stage with that understanding that the generation stage can be used as an environment or platform for the completion stage. So it is not the case that it's something that you're going to like cast aside or discard. There are legitimate reasons why great masters such as Junglo Drutai, in writing about Vajrayana in the theoretical context, such as in his Treasury of Knowledge, make it sound as though once you reach a certain point you don't need it. But if you look at how he actually lived, I mean, he practiced these various things that he did. As far as we know, I mean, he did so many different things, and he had his own terma that it's hard to know. But basically, it looks as though Junglo Drutai's two major personal yidams were the Jawa Gyamtso of the Karma Kagyu tradition and Vajrakila, but also White Tara. Definitely Jawa Gyamtso and Vajrakila. Okay. Now, the meditation of the completion stage is broadly divided into two approaches. What's called the path of means, Upaya Marga, and the path of liberation, Moksha Marga. And the path of means is basically using prana to access and control the mind. So by shutting down a coarse and subtle prana, leaving only very subtle prana functioning or moving, by shutting down movement, it would be better to say, of coarse and subtle prana, you shut down the movement of mind, and therefore exposing the undiluted, basic, or fundamental mind. The path of liberation is where you use recognition of the mind's nature to automatically shut down coarse and subtle prana. So either one, we believe, in the Kagyu and Nyingma traditions, will work. In practical terms, most practitioners tend to combine them. No one ever seems to practice the path of means totally devoid of the path of liberation. And nobody who has access to instructions on the path of means seems to totally ignore it. One distinction that is comes from the Dokpo Kagyu, and Lama Tratop has mentioned this, it's clearly stated in Terchen Barway Dorje's writings about the Barong Kagyu in particular, is that the general recommendation is that if you begin the path when you're young, more emphasis should be placed on the path of means, because you can use your youthful vigor and physical strength to advantage. And if you begin the path in middle or later age, it is recommended to emphasize the path of liberation, because you'll be less vigorous less able to handle the hardships of and rigors of the path of means, and but perhaps more mature emotionally and more able to recognize your mind's nature. But it's also a matter of personal choice, and there's no, it's like there's no cutoff. Like if you're 40 or older, you have to go to this room, and if you're 40 or younger, you have to go to that room. It's not like that. The path of means, which we'll look at first, can take several different forms. In the Dagpo Kagyu and Shongpo Kagyu traditions, it's typically put into the rubric of what are called the 6 dharmas, which are essentially aspects of the path of means, each of which is basically a complete path itself, but that focus on 6 situations that we deal with in our lives. These are the delusion of the waking state, the remedy for which is the practice of the illusory body, the delusion of the dream state, the remedy for which is the practice of the dream or dream yoga, the delusion of deep sleep, the remedy for which is the practice of luminosity or the clear light, the delusion of sexual desire and sexual activity or arousal and pleasure, the remedy for which is the practice of chandali or tumo, the delusion of the moment of death, the remedy for which is the practice of the ejection or boa of consciousness, and the delusion that occurs after death, the remedy for which is the practices associated with the Bardo. In the Nyingma tradition, there are many cycles of terma, especially where these are found in that more or less similar format. But often the arrangement and the means employed can be put slightly differently. And in other traditions, there are other formulations. I think that the best way to look at the path of means as a gradual set of things to understand how it works is to look at Nagarjuna's formulation of it as the 5 stages. Nagarjuna and his disciple Aryadeva wrote, or these are attributed to them, the most classic Indian treatises. I mean, obviously they were Indian treatises because they were written by Indians. So the most classic early treatises on the completion stage. And the most important of these is called the Panchakrama, which means the 5 stages. You know punch, the beverage punch? I always thought it came from punch, like it packed a punch, but that's not where it comes from at all. It comes from the Hindi and Sanskrit word punch, or 5. You know when we were making offerings, we say pancha amrita? Right. It means a mixture. It was a word used going back to at least the times when this stuff was first taught, for a mixture of different intoxicants and fruit juices and things like that. So the English must have got it along with the learning how to cook from India, and so it's punch, and sometimes it'll just say punch. You don't even have the amrita; it just mahapunch. We say pensa, or pantsa, but you're not offering your pants. You're offering punch. Okay, that a little bit of diversion there. Now, so the 5 stages are normally associated with Father Tantra because they're based on the Buddhist teachings in Guhya Samaja, which is a Father Tantra common to the Sarma and Nyingma traditions. But there is also a Mother Tantra formulation of the 5 stages based on the Chakra Samvara. The terminology is different, but the basically, as Mipam says, you know, it goes through the same basically the same stages. I'm going to use Nagarjuna's original presentation, or the structure of it. I won't be quoting from it. Because, for one thing, in his notes on the words of my perfect teacher, Khenpo Ngaga chooses to use this as an example of the completion stage. So there are 5 stages, so therefore there are 6. And the 6 stages are physical isolation, which doesn't count, so that's stage 0. Then verbal isolation, which is the first stage. Mental isolation, the second stage. Illusory body, which is the third stage. Clear light or luminosity, which is the 4th stage. And unity or unification, which is the 5th stage. And of course, that also has 2 parts, learner's unity and non-learner's unity. Now, physical isolation is not counted as one of the 5 stages because it is properly the apex of the generation stage. And you'll see why. But nevertheless, it is also a part of the completion stage. Now, the practitioner, and this is an example of where you need to have mastered the generation stage, because this is very much the completion stage of Mahayoga, which emphasizes the generation stage. The practitioner is qualified to begin the practice of physical isolation when he or she has a reliably stable, extremely vivid, clear visualization of the mandala. So in Goya Samaja it would be 32 deities, but whichever mandala. So that the forms of the deities appear in their proper colors, with their proper scepters and apparel. The palace appears, the palace and the elements and all the stuff that goes with it, all of this appears clearly with nothing left out. And the measure of this is that the pupils, pupil is the thing in the middle, right? And then the thing around is the iris? Yes. Okay. The pupils, irises, and the whites of the eyes of each and every one of the deities must be completely clear. So that's the level of visualization that is a prerequisite for beginning. That is not physical isolation. That's the preliminary to it. The practice of physical isolation is, in its classic form, I mean, there are different instructions, but is while maintaining that visualization of the mandala with yourself as the principal, you imagine a duplicate of that mandala as distinct as the main one, but entirely contained within a sphere of light no bigger than, I guess, one joint of a finger at most. And then you eventually, I guess, it gets smaller at the tip of your nose. So you'd be imagining yourself as the principal with all the entourage, everybody complete, plus there's an identical mandala contained in a sphere at the tip of your nose, right here. And you meditate on that until that gives you, and I don't remember how it's measured, but some control over prana. Then the sphere is visualized at the tip of your genitals. And you visualize that until that gives you control over a bindu, over your bodhicitta. And at that point, I believe you've accomplished physical isolation. And because it's primarily a matter of visualization, it's considered a segue between generation and completion. The practice of verbal isolation, which is the principal practice of the second empowerment, is to use either chandali or the vajra repetition of the completion stage or a combination of both. In the Father Tantra, it's more emphasis on vajra repetition, in Mother Tantra on chandali, from what I can tell, to bring all your prana into the avaduti, the central channel. And when you have caused the prana, all of prana, to enter, remain, and then finally dissolve into the central channel, you have completed the stage or branch of verbal isolation. The practice of mental isolation is the principal practice of the third empowerment. And this has two aspects. According to some teachers, it must involve, and this is based on the teachings of Father Tantra, I think it must involve a consort. According to others, that may not be necessary. And it's what we call a difficult point. A difficult point is when two people you respect, two writers you respect, such as the eminent masters of different traditions and so on, disagree about something. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we follow the Talmudic example of, so-and-so said this, but so-and-so said that, and so-and-so said this. So we leave it as a difficult point because out of respect for the fact that these writers, must have had good reasons for their different opinions. In any case, whether or not the sexual yoga is needed or practiced, what must be done, and this is a lot of the practice of the third empowerment, is the two samadhis of gradual elimination. And it's so funny to find a word for this, Rudzin. You could say getting hold of it all at once, or grasping the whole thing. And these samadhis are well known to you already. But this, as I said yesterday, this will explain why people will often call the end of the generation stage a completion stage practice, because it actually is, but not if done just as a quick thing in the generation stage. Grasping the whole is where visualizing yourself as the deity dissolves from the top down, the bottom up, sides in, into the seed syllable in the very center of the heart. And then that dissolves upward into finally a little tadpole-like thing called a nada, and that dissolves up into a smaller thing, about 1/100th of a hair's diameter, and then that dissolves into emptiness or into nothing. And then as soon as a thought arises, you re-arise as the deity and you do it again. And that's the main practice. The second samadhi, which is even more emphasized, is progressive elimination. In progressive elimination, you visualize the entire mandala, as you did during the practices of physical and verbal isolation, and you dissolve it gradually from the outside in. To simplify it, basically the environment, the palace and its basis and so on, dissolve into the deities and the entourage, who dissolve from the outer ring in, gradually dissolving into the principle, and then the principle will dissolve as before. Now, why is this not the completion stage when we do it at the end of a session of generation stage practice, and yet it is here? Because of what has preceded it. When we do it, we're just imagining it. Well, I can't speak for you, but I can speak for myself. When I do it, I'm just imagining it. A practitioner who has completed verbal isolation and does this in order to achieve mental isolation, because they've already got control of their prana and bindu, they're actually dissolving their, what we would call subtle body. I don't want to sound new agey, but there is a subtle body. And they're actually not just imagining it. When the person actually succeeds in achieving mental isolation, the state they achieve, the recognition they gain, is called the analogous, or some people say example, clear light or luminosity. It's not the clear light or luminosity that is the ground, Buddha nature itself, but it's similar to it. When they arise from that samadhi, they arise in what's called an impure illusory body. It's a illusory body that will look like the deity spontaneously. They don't have to imagine it anymore. According to some writers, it's white. The illusory body is always white or of 5 colors. It's called impure because their wind mind, their prana mind, that is the substance of which the illusory body is made, is still not purified. That is, then they, when they subsequently manage to, again, through the same practice, essentially, dissolve that illusory body in a new way, then they experience what's called the actual clear light. And the actual clear light is not the ground either. It's some of it, but it's not all of it. But when they arise from that, they will arise in what's called the body of unity, a learner's unity. So it's like a learner's permit versus a driver's license. The learner's unity is the state of a bodhisattva versus that of a Buddha. When they dissolve that, that state of learner's unity is called the pure illusory body. When they dissolve, because by now their wind mind, their karma mind is purified. When they finally dissolve that, then they dissolve it into what's called the ultimate actual clear light. And that is the ground. That is the Dharmakaya. when they arise from that, as a Sambhogakaya Buddha, they arise in the non-learner's body of unity. They're now a fully awakened Buddha who has a body that is the pure illusory body, the Sambhogakaya, and a mind that is the mind of clear light. And these have been fully unified. And it's no longer made, the illusory body is no longer made of prana mind. If it's the true Sambhogakaya, it transcends that. And this is very important to understand, especially for the Nyingma tradition, which does not emphasize the 5 stages, although they're certainly taught and no doubt practiced by some. Because it's important for us to make a distinction between the true Sambhogakaya and a semblance of the deity made from wind mind. The two are different. Okay, so that's the path of means in its most classic formulation. It obviously depends upon an amazing degree of generation stage stability and clarity, and a great deal of hard work. The samadhis involved, the physical isolation, verbal isolation, whether it's the chandali or the vajra repetition, and the samadhis of the clear light practiced in mental isolation, the grasping the whole and progressive elimination, will need to be enhanced by at least certain physical exercises, and in addition, possibly, according to some writers, definitely a consort practice. So that is the path of means. There are other ways it can be presented without going through all the stages. Sometimes the path of means is presented entirely as the practice of chandali. And especially in the tradition of Jitsun Milarepa, it's very clear. Milarepa practiced the 5 stages as well as those practices of Mother Tantra. But he, in his own writings and teachings, he made it very clear that he believed that chandali alone could bring someone to the, by which I don't mean only chandali, but I mean chandali is sufficient to bring someone to the point where the nature of their mind could be pointed out, and they could practice Mahamudra in the full sense of that term. So Jitsun Mila's way of transmitting the Mahamudra was principally, from what our teachers have written, a concise form of the path of means as a segue to the path of liberation. So you need not assume that every path of means is going to be as step by step as the five stages. Then we have the path of liberation. And the path of liberation can involve some preliminaries, such as tranquility and insight, which may or may not be the same as the tranquility and insight of the sutra, the Mahayana. But the actual path of liberation, as we understand it, begins when the student has their mind pointed out successfully by a master. Now, this brings up a question. If recognition of the mind's nature is so sufficient to begin the path of liberation, What does it entail? Part of the problem here is that it can mean very different things for very different people. One of the clearest explanations of this that I've ever seen was written by Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, of whom Lama Tratot speaks frequently. And in one of his writings, he says that when a person on the path of accumulation, the first of the 5 paths, not to be confused with the 5 stages, when a person on the path of accumulation receives a successful pointing out instruction, because of course there's no guarantee, you know. It's not recognize your mind's nature within 30 days or all your money back. It's not like that. When a person on the path of accumulation gains that recognition through its being pointed out, it's basically understanding. When a person on the path of juncture receives it, if they receive it at that point, then it is experience. And when a person on the path of seeing receives it, it is realization. Now, what's the difference? One traditional analogy is the moon. You can have a painting of the moon, a very good painting, a photograph of the moon, the crescent moon seen through a window, the crescent moon seen from out of doors without glass in between, and the full moon. And these are all the moon. So when a person on the path of accumulation receives the pointing out instruction, what actually happens is it's like being, imagine you've never seen the moon. You've heard about the moon. Everyone wants to see the moon. It's so famous, but you've never seen it. You see this funny kind of light sometimes at night, and you don't really know where it comes from. And you think it might be the moon, it might not be the moon. But so you go to somebody who's supposed to know all about the moon, and they show you a painting of the moon. They say, you see, it's this shape, and you know, when it's full, it will look like this, and it has these like holes in it and stuff, and the gray areas and so on. And they point out each and everything. It's just, that's what to look for. Now, have you seen the moon when you leave that artist's studio or whatever? No. You've seen a similitude of the moon. But when you manage to go outside, will you recognize the moon? Probably. And that's the advantage of giving the pointing out instruction to beginners, such as ourselves, those on the path of accumulation. The path of accumulation begins in the Mahayana with the generation of bodhicitta. As soon as you first generate the sincere intention to achieve Buddhahood for the good of others, you have begun the lesser path of accumulation. And as those of you who attended the stages of the path, either the one that Lama's gone through or the brief thing of the Nagumas that I did a couple of years ago, will know that there are 3 levels of the path of accumulation, so on and so forth. But basically, the clock starts ticking when you first generate bodhicitta. When someone completes the path of accumulation, they achieve the path of juncture. And juncture is basically, it has 4 parts, but it's basically a segue between the accumulation of merit and the, we could say, sublimation of that merit into wisdom when they achieve the path of seeing. There are two ways to understand the two accumulations. One way is that we gather both from the beginning, the accumulation of merit and the accumulation of wisdom. And that is true, in a sense. Another way to say it is an individual on the two mundane paths, the paths of accumulation and juncture, can only accumulate merit. But when they achieve the path of seeing, all that merit is transformed, ennobled into the accumulation of wisdom. And that's what they principally accumulate as a bodhisattva. And in a sense, that is true, too. Ultimately speaking, meditators, we do a lot of stuff to accumulate merit. We make offerings, we engage in acts of generosity, we clean shrine rooms, we build temples, all this kind of stuff. But and these are important because they're easy for us to do. It's much easier. Ultimately speaking, for a practitioner, there are two ways to accumulate merit and two ways to accumulate wisdom. In post-meditation, we accumulate merit principally by cultivating the desire to help others. And the accumulation of wisdom principally by strengthening our resolve or resolution to achieve Buddhahood in order to help others in post-meditation. In meditation, we gather the accumulation of merit principally by seeing the mind's lucidity. And we gather the accumulation of wisdom principally by seeing the mind's emptiness. And that it also brings us back to the value of the generation stage, because the generation stage, while not as easy as building temples and cleaning shrine rooms, is a way of encountering your mind's lucidity. So when you visualize yourself as a deity, the stuff of which the deity is made is nothing other than your mind's lucidity. And it is your mind's lucidity that is aware of it, that creates it, is aware of it, experiences it, imagines it, and is itself the stuff of which it is made. It exists nowhere else. Anyway, when someone reaches the path of juncture, which means that they're almost ready to become a bodhisattva, to achieve the path of seeing, if they receive the pointing out instruction then it's like being shown a photograph of the moon. It's closer than the artist's painting. And if the person receives it on or at the juncture of the path of seeing, then it is like being shown the crescent moon. And then eventually they continue to watch the moon as it becomes full. And that's, in the metaphor or the analogy, the achievement of Buddhahood. So fundamentally, the path of liberation consists of meditation that is your mind looking at itself. And you accumulate merit by encountering your mind's lucidity. You accumulate wisdom by encountering your mind's emptiness. Now, what I'm talking about here is the common path of liberation. In other words, what is common to both Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions. There are uncommon features to the Dzogchen tradition, but I can't talk about them here. It's not appropriate for this venue. Not venue, but format. The conduct of the completion stage depends upon the form of the completion stage that the practitioner, in which the practitioner is engaged. If someone is engaged in the path of liberation solely, or places principal emphasis on that, then the conduct that is required is called the all-good conduct. And that means simply to be as good and kind to everyone as possible, to engage in post-meditation in good and helpful actions, and basically to be a good Boy Scout or Girl Scout. And that is, generally speaking, the conduct that's recommended for everybody. When on the path of means a practitioner reaches, I think it's verbal isolation, has completed verbal isolation, they may need to engage in what's called the conduct, which is the discipline of awareness. And we do practice aspects of that as beginners as well. For example, the practice of chu, or severance, is an aspect of that conduct. And because what you're doing in the discipline of awareness is subjecting yourself, testing yourself by putting yourself in difficult situations. In the case of the practice of chu, you are doing that by inviting spirits to consume your body. But other forms of this are, for example, when you might go into an unfriendly situation and see if it bothers you or not. And there are forms of that too that beginners can do, like the echo practice, where you go to a place with good echoes and you say nice things about yourself to yourself, and imagining that they're said by someone else, and then you say terrible things. You call yourself the worst names you can imagine, and see if it bothers you. And if it doesn't bother you, then you get friends to do it. And if that bothers you, then you stop there and you go back to the drawing table. But if it doesn't bother you, back to the drawing table. It's almost as though we think that all crazy people are architects, isn't it? Or engineers? Yeah. So or maybe all great yogis. So anyway, so if when your friends do it, it doesn't bother you, then you get people who really don't like you. You instigate them doing this, and you see if that bothers you or not. No, I didn't ask you. She always does this here. It never happens at home. But the thing's basically gone to sleep, and then I'll be translating for Rinpoche or Lama Trato, and somehow something I say gets Siri to wake up and start talking to me. I never use Siri. She frightens me. She reminds me of Hal in 2001, which just indicates how old I am. That actually, the actor who played him died last year. A Canadian actor, Douglas something, I forget. Anyway, of course it had to be a Canadian, right? I'm Canadian by birth, I should say that, so not if anyone's up there. If someone perfects the conduct, which is the discipline of awareness, so that they've experienced what Naropa calls equal flavor. And that's a whole separate teaching that is practiced principally by the Drukpa Kagyu. Then they can engage in the third and final type of conduct, which is the conduct victorious in all directions. And that's appropriate for somebody who is a Mahasiddha and can, as they say, like Naropa, some nasty kids, or Naropa went begging, and some nasty kids gave him razors, because he said he would eat whatever he was given. So this nasty kid handed him a razor blade, and it melted into like butter in his mouth. So you can do that if you can do that. So that's these two, the discipline of awareness and the conduct of total victory, are in the category of don't try this at home. Now the results. Yesterday we saw that the principal result of the generation stage is the first of the 4 Vidyadhara levels, that one, by transforming one's mind into the deity, through a level of visualization that is not quite physical isolation, but almost at it, where certainly the forms of the deities are pure down to their irises and pupils and whites of their eyes. Then the person's mind will have, because they've not gotten control over prana and bindu, they cannot transform their body or control their lifespan. But when they die, their mind will become the deity, and they'll immediately become the third type of Vidyadhara, which we'll get to in a minute. If someone perfects what we've called here verbal isolation, I mean, it could be called other things, but then they gain control over their lifespan. So they have not totally transformed their body into the deities, but it's they have control over how long they live. And when someone achieves the, I guess you could call it the equivalent to the learner's unity through the samadhis of mental isolation, then they have actually transformed their body into this illusory body, the pure illusory body, but not the final body of unity, the learner's unity. And that's what's called a mudra or mahamudra Vidyadhara. Now, if the person achieves the first of the 4 stages, the fully ripened Vidyadhara, and dies at that level, then they become a mahamudra Vidyadhara in the Bardor. And if the person achieves the perfect non-learner's unity, then they become what's called a Vidyadhara of spontaneous presence, which means that they are basically a Buddha in all but name, a Buddha functioning as a bodhisattva. Because they would still be working, or possibly still be working within the teaching period of another Buddha. So they wouldn't, it's kind of like take that job. They're working under that, working for the same firm. An example of that is Guru Rinpoche. Now, here it's important to mention that these 4 Vidyadhara levels, the fully ripened Vidyadhara with control over lifespan, Mahamudra Vidyadhara, and Vidyadhara of spontaneous presence, can be achieved solely without the path of means at all, solely through the practice of Dzogchen as well. That is not always spelled out. It is spelled out in the writings and terma of Terchen Barway Dorje. So that's why, if you look at the Song of Samantabhadra that the aspiration that we recite at the end of the 10th day feast, you'll see a correlation between the 4 appearances and the 4 Vidyadhara levels. And that is, as far as I have seen and received, that's not as clearly spelled out in other cycles. So, okay, now let's have questions. Mike.
I just can't write fast enough. The second type of Vidyadhara, so fully ripened, and then?
Vidyadhara with control over lifespan.
And why do we visualize the Vidyadharas in our throat?
Because that's where they are. There are primordial Vidyadharas who are, they're called the Vidyadhara, the fully ripened Vidyadharas in the middle, then the Vidyadhara on the stages, which is a kind of a 5th one. It's not really separate, but because, it's there, is in front. Vidyadhara with control over lifespan is to the right. The Vidyadhara, Mahamudra Vidyadhara is behind, and the Vidyadhara of spontaneous presence is to the left. The central one, the fully ripened Vidyadhara, is multicolored. The front one is white, the right one is yellow, the back one is red, and the left one is green. And they look like semi-wrathful deities. They're kind of like dancing with their consorts, and usually, sometimes they're shown holding hooked knives and skull cups. Sometimes they're playing damaros and ringing bells as they dance. But the reason why we imagine them there is because that's where they are. The peaceful and wrathful deities are actually present within every living sentient being's body, certainly within the human body. I'm not quite sure how it works with other species. And they're there. Now, obviously, if someone were vivisected, you wouldn't find them. And obviously, if you perform an autopsy, you don't find them. So, in what sense are they present? Well, and this is the whole thing of spontaneous presence. In what sense it's not the same as, but it's a little bit like, it's obviously not the same as, but it's a little bit like data storage. The photographs and documents that are on my iPad, you won't find them by cutting open the iPad and looking at, I don't know what's actually in an iPad, but it can't be that much. And yet, they're retrievable from there. So they're there, but in a way that is, well, to me, in the case of the technology, infinitely spooky. I'm less spooked out by the peaceful and wrathful deities because, like Siri just, which will just pop out of nowhere and think I'm talking to her. And the peaceful and wrathful deities so far have not done that to me, although I'd appreciate it if they did. And so, yeah, that's why.
But you haven't talked about their relationship to the aspect of speech.
Well, the Vidyadharas are the teachers. They teach. That's the aspect of speech. But it's not quite that simple. Well, maybe it is. I mean, you can sort of, I mean, I guess you could say that.
And what else would you like to say about it?
Nothing at the moment.
Yeah. Anybody?
In terms of the difficult points, is that mostly a scholarly issue? In other words, if we're following a certain tradition with a certain teacher, that's probably not going to be much of a concern for in a practical level.
Well, it depends on the difficult point. I mean, I would think that for adherents of traditions, you know, it's I find it somewhat ironic that the traditions that are the most devoted to monasticism historically are also the ones that insist that consort practice is necessary. You know, the Nyingma tradition, which is much more accommodating of family people, or has been historically, doesn't insist on it. It's you know, I mean, it's taught if you want, but it's not a necessary thing. And the Karma Kagyu also hold that it's not necessary. You know, that the practice of Chandali alone can be a sufficient path of means without any other conditions being required, except, of course, there has to be some recognition. I suspect the difference is that in the Nyingma and Kagyu traditions, the path of means is never taught without the path of liberation. And I think that means, if you'll pardon the pun, that means that fewer means are necessary. I suspect that. I haven't seen that put exactly that way, but I suspect that. Now, how much practical difference this makes? Well, so few people probably reach verbal isolation that, you know, it might be rather a moot point. You know, and all these these fancy tantric techniques are fun to talk about, but they involve incredible discipline. As His Eminence Sutta Rinpoche, not speaking of that specifically, but speaking once said, Dharma is not for fun. You know, it's not, Dharma can bring joy, of course, because you're doing good, you're helping others, and the less you think about yourself and the more you think about others, the happier you are. I mean, that's basically the secret to happiness, right? I mean, we screw it up again and again, because as soon as we think we've discovered the secret of happiness, we start caring about our own happiness, and then we mess it up. So Dharma can bring joy, but Dharma is not fun. We're not trying to have fun. And, but it can sound like it's fun, and which can confuse people a little bit, you know. I saw when we went into my first retreat. One of the retreatants thought, I don't know what he thought. He said, man, I keep on waiting for the fun to start. And it never really started. It just gets...
Did he make it?
Oh yeah. No, he's doing very well. I don't know if he's having fun yet, though. Yes.
The Vidyadharas are associated with speech and with teaching, even in this
Well, I infer that.
Okay.
I've never actually seen that said.
Okay.
I just know that they're here.
Okay.
They're in your throat.
So maybe you won't be able to answer this question, and it's not meant to be flippant. I have a feeling it's happened to everybody at some point, where you have your usual discursive thoughts, and then all of a sudden you have a cutting through voice. And sometimes it's a voice that stops you right before something bad is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I've been having this conversation with others. It seems like everybody's had some instant where there's a stop.
Mm.
And you wake up and it doesn't sound like your normal everyday voice. Is this possibly the Vidyadharas, or what is commonly thought in the Buddhist
Does this
tradition?
happen to you as you're waking up?
No, it happens in the course of daily life, and I have
Yeah.
my shopping
Yeah.
list stuff going on, and a few times people say guardian angels.
Yeah.
If you're Christian.
I don't think I have that voice. I wish I had that
Oh, God,
voice.
yeah.
There have been several times where if
Yeah.
I'd heard a voice that said, stop,
Right.
it would have been much
It's usually
much better.
like an emergency. Like I was almost killed
Yeah.
in walking through a park, and I heard a male voice, almost yell in my head, "Turn around now," and was able to duck a killing blow.
Tibetans typically say that that's the protective deities of your family. In other words, we inherit, and they're considered mundane, but they're beneficial. We inherit certain gods and goddesses from our parents' stuff.
Okay.
And what these are, I don't know. And they classify them as the father god, the mother god, the shoulder god, no, the uncle god, the kitchen god, hearth god. Maybe that's the same thing. Hearth god is the same. And then there's a list of 5 and a list of 9. You know where you can read about them? Behind you somewhere there's the folder with the gray edge has the fire puja we do the day before Losar.
Okay.
Yeah, that
Cleansing
it
smoke.
has a list. Yeah, it has a list of them in there somewhere.
Okay.
But that's what most lamas. People ask this question a lot
They
because
do,
a lot
okay.
of people, as you said, have this experience, and some of us never do. But that's what most lamas have answered when I've heard this question asked.
Okay.
I wouldn't think it would be the Vidyadharas themselves,
Okay.
but actually the Vidyadharas in the throat are interesting because they often they don't receive as much attention as the peaceful deities and the wrathful deities themselves, and so a lot of times they're not even visualized in mandalas and so on. They're kind of like just, I don't know, I don't know why they don't get more attention, but they're there.
Excuse me if this question is exceedingly stupid, but
There's no such thing as a stupid question.
when we're thinking talking about visualizing and realizing and all of that, one thing that sometimes comes to mind, besides psychotic people who are convinced of a particular reality
Yes.
that all of us don't,
Right.
also is shamanistic traditions.
Of
where
course.
a lot of the shaman actually live in a world that's alien to all of us.
Yes. Or they enter it at will. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing is, in my meager experience in meditation, where does one experience this? Because one experiences in meditation things physically in the body, imaginatively in the mind, which one is using actually the visual organs, but not seeing outside. And all the processes of developing things like that. For example, actors who embody, the method actors,
Right.
who try to embody a different person.
Yes.
How does,
How do all these things fit
well,
together?
how do we approach it, or should we not make any judgment of things like that? That is, should we not try to think, where is it? Because in meditation, even, we tend to feel very specifically things in the body, things in the mind, we get images, and then we get those instinctive things that she just mentioned that just bubble up from the obscure side of mind.
Right.
And also then there's the dream
Yeah.
side of things.
Well, first of all, that's as far from being a stupid question as any question could be. It's a very valid and important question, and it has a whole bunch of bits and pieces. So it's good. That's good, because now we have something to talk about that will take us till noon, and maybe begin the afternoon. First of all, you mentioned psychotic reality. And I am not, obviously not a psychiatrist. I'm a patient of psychiatrists, but I'm not a psychiatrist. So I don't know that much about psychosis. But I have heard a number of my teachers, Tibetan Buddhist teachers, have said that they suspect that some of the what's going on in the brain of a psychotic person may be a cousin, so to speak, of what goes on in the brain of a visionary. Now, there are people, by visionary I don't mean an enlightened person, I mean a person who sees dead people. I've known several people, mostly Tibetans, who see ghosts, they see local deities, they can describe them to you. I've met a few and I've heard of others, and in some cases, they'll walk into a room and they'll see so many spirits that they're trying to avoid them, but they just walk right through them. And now the reason that they say a cousin or a distant cousin is that the similarity between the two things is that in both cases, the person sees things that most other people don't see. The dissimilarities are two. The first is that the reality witnessed by the visionary is verifiable. In other words, other people may experience the same thing if they're also visionaries. And it also doesn't cause them to behave antisocially. So it doesn't have the emotional problem that psychosis would. But I think that some of my teachers have indicated that they suspect that what makes a person, not that a visionary person is necessarily going to become psychotic or even be more apt to at all, but that there are some similarities in the type of brain that makes you that way. Now, what is the stuff that these people see in both cases? The psychotic person who, sees, I don't know, I always say green dragons for some reason, because so who sees a green dragon sitting on that cushion. Now I just imagine something cute. Well, because I like cute animals, so I just sort of imagined it. It's cute. I have a tendency to turn everything into Disney. It's not good. So the person who sees a green dragon sitting on that cushion, what is that green dragon made of? Because in their psychotic reality, they actually see it. Now, there are also types of psychosis where they don't see stuff. They have other kinds of things. So, I mean, we're talking about kind of a particular... Yeah. And, but what is it made of? Well, it's made of nothing. And what are the spirits that the person, the visionary, sees made of? They're made of nothing. What is the stuff we imagine when we're imagining ourselves as a deity or a deity in front, or that's made of nothing. It's not made up of anything. And the remaining point to this is, what is this stuff made up of? It's made up of nothing. And the only reason why this stuff seems so real to us is because of our habit. It is actually our habits that make reality impermeable. And I'll give you an example of this in my own experience. I often pause to check on A, whether I'm dead and in the bardo, and B, whether I'm dreaming. And usually I'm not dreaming. So far I haven't been dead. But what my test is, usually I try to stick my finger through something that my finger shouldn't be able to go through. And obviously when I do this and I'm awake, nothing happens. I usually do it discreetly. I'm just checking, but nothing happens. But when I'm dreaming, and I, depending upon the depth of the sleep, my fixation on the dream reality, even though I'm already pretty sure it's a dream, is so strong that, you'd think my hand would just go through like nothing, but it doesn't. It's like rubber. I can get through. My finger will go through the wood, but I'll have to push a bit. And that has brought it home to me how we structure and create reality, because I know I'm dreaming at that point, Otherwise I would have, not carried on with it. But it's still, even though I know I'm dreaming, I still have to push to get my finger through the damn table. And then I'll get up and I'll try walls, and it's still, there's a little bit of, of solidity to it. That's how damned habitual we are. Or I am. I don't know. I'm just speaking for myself. Yeah. Well, that didn't take as long as it.
I can expand a little bit on that, if you don't mind.
I would love.
In terms of experience when one is meditating, like I said, I am aware of some of it. I am aware that some of that is I'm conscious that there has to be more than that.
Yes.
And at that level, one, like you said, there is for example, what happens when one wakes up and how aware one can be in the process of waking up. And just that process of being asleep to awake, or going the reverse, trying to be awake and go into sleep and then go into sleep yoga or whatever it is. All of that, generally speaking, tends to be experienced as a whole, but at the same time, when one is meditating, one is aware of, for example, breath. You're aware of that in a physical sense. There is a mental aspect to it, but it's physical.
Yes.
And in terms of images, we tend to use our eyes, even though the eyes might be closed. That is,
Right.
we use our visual. And I'm wondering about all those experiences that we classify high up in terms of this. Could we assume that the people who
physical.
are very well trained, etc., are experiencing more subtle aspects of all of this? Like you had said before, is there a sixth sense or a seventh sense?
Yeah.
Or do you think that that's just, that the definition of all of that is perhaps a little bit too fuzzy, and we won't be able to get the details of that until we're there?
In the Buddhist definition of this is not fuzzy at all. In fact, it's a little bit too picayune. Picayune, of course, is the name of the New Orleans newspaper, Times-Picayune. But somehow Picayune always sounds like picky to me, so I always misuse it that way. First of all, this wasn't your question, but you reminded me, or you brought up something that's in your question that is important to mention. And that's that the awareness alone will accomplish the goals of the path of means. And this is one of the reasons why in the Nyingma tradition it's less common. It's not by no means uncommon, but it's less common to have separate, yoga for dreaming, yoga for sleeping. I mean, they have these things, but mostly in the Nyingma tradition, which emphasizes awareness, it's seen as a natural result of being more aware and not requiring a separate technique. So the difference in approach would be basically, you could have a more, not compartmentalized, because that's now used pejoratively, a more specified approach where you have this technique for dealing with the waking state, more divided. This technique for dealing with the waking state, and this technique for dealing with the dream state, and this technique for dealing with deep sleep, and this technique for dealing with sex.
Even in awareness of awareness, you can keep splitting that.
Yeah, but if the path of liberation, as we understand it, is properly practiced, one awareness, ideally unbroken, but rarely so for beginners, but recurrent awareness will, as you described in your question, suffice. Awareness alone is all sufficient. Now, the issue of physical and mental experience and perception, ultimately, all experience must be mental. Otherwise, we don't experience it.
Right.
And so Buddhism talks a lot about the difference between the sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. There are two others, but we don't need them for this issue. Right. And in fact, some Buddhist teachers don't accept the existence of the two others at all, which is also a difficult point. When I look at something, when I see something, I'm actually seeing it finally with my mind.
Yes.
I mean, the science of perception can prove how that works and so on. And the Buddhist tradition is obviously less medical, less technological. It basically just says that, your mental consciousness creates a replica of the data of the eye consciousness. And the mental consciousness, therefore, serves two functions. Its first function is non-conceptual, simply to copy. And the second function is to identify, and so on, which is conceptual. So in meditation practice, in some forms of meditation practice, what we're doing, we're working with the sixth consciousness, is attempting to limit it to its first function, ideally, to non-conceptual perception. But in meditation literature, they say that, Junglo Drutai writes about this in various places, that the best practitioner will be able to limit their mental consciousness to that first function, purely non-conceptual. And a lesser practitioner should be able to limit it to identification, but not, which is a conceptual function, but not the imposition of further concepts based on that identification. So in other words, the difference is, let's say I look at Davis's shirt. Let's say I'm meditating and it's in my line of sight. If I were the first type, which I'm not, I would not even recognize the Nike emblem or is that Nike? Yeah, or the color. I wouldn't think light maroon or whatever. But at least what I can try to do is, okay, maroon, so what? Nike, so what? Not pursue it.
Judging.
But then what happens to me when I'm distracted is I think, I'm so sick of all this maroon. So Nike, wasn't there something about them in China? There was some sort of deal with that, and that's what we're trying not to do. Now, nevertheless, there is another issue that you bring up in your question, which is about, and it goes back to tsema, or the study of valid cognition and logic in Buddhism, but now we're talking about perception. One form of there are three types of validity accepted. Now, the term validity is difficult because, of course, in English, we use validity to mean the validity of an argument as opposed to its truthfulness. So, in other words, if I say, I have 5 eyes, everyone with 5 eyes is from the planet Mars, therefore I'm from the planet Mars, that is a valid argument, but not a true one, because I don't have 5 eyes, and I'm not from the planet Mars, and I have no idea if there's anybody from the planet Mars, or what kind of eyes they have, or what. But in Buddhism, validity is used to mean both truth and logical soundness.
Right.
So there are 3 types of validity accepted in Buddhism, of which I'm going to be irreverent and admit that I only accept 2 of them. These are valid direct perception, or the validity of direct perception, validity of inference, the logical validity, like with a syllogism. And the third is validity of scripture, which is that in Buddhism, you're allowed to cite scripture as a basis for making an assertion, an argument. I don't find the assertion of scripture valid, but that's just me.
It's very useful.
It's useful, yeah. It's a good way of getting out of a tight spot. But what we're talking about here is the validity of direct perception. So there are 4 types of this, of ngonsum, or direct perception, in the study of validity. Wompo ngonsum, sensory direct valid perception. Yichi ngonsum, mental, direct, valid perception. Ronrik-ngunsum, self-aware, direct, valid perception, and Naljung-ngunsum, Sema, yogic, direct, valid cognition. Sensory direct valid cognition is simply what your senses, the data that your senses record. And that's considered valid because it is simply sense data. So the fact that I know that I only perceive colors the way I do because of my species and my brain and what all that does not invalidate, from a Buddhist point of view, the fact that, I see maroon as maroon and orange, burnt orange, I would say, as burnt orange, and, and so on. And the argument is that, now, of course, there are difficult points here about the validity of what's valid and what's not. But mental direct valid cognition is is that first moment, the non-conceptual duplication of the sense data. Everything after that, the second moment, the identification, and everything, all the stuff about maroon and Nike and all of that, that's invalid. None of that has validity. Even the thought maroon, that's all invalid. Self-aware direct valid cognition is the fact that, for those who accept it, which we do, that the mind has the ability to experience itself. And that's a valid thing. Yogic direct valid cognition can be divided into concordant yogic direct valid cognition and true yogic direct valid cognition. Concordant yogic direct valid cognition is defined as the experience of emptiness by someone who has not achieved the path of seeing. True yogic direct valid cognition is the experience of emptiness by a bodhisattva in even placement or by a Buddha at any time. So, with these higher states of realization, if we assert that they are valid, they must be one of these four types of valid direct valid cognition. I haven't talked about this in years. I forget all my jargon. One of my teachers is a man, he's retired from teaching, named Khenpo Tsutram Gyamtso. He's a great Khenpo of the Karma Kagyu, also associated with the Chodrak Monastery of the Baram Kagyu, where one of his teachers, who was also one of Lama Tratop's teachers, was associated. Lama Tratop's talked about that guy who would drink his tea out of his piss pot. That guy, yeah, he was Khenpo Tsutram's, one of his main teachers. Khenpo Tsutram told me, in answer to a question about this, and this was in my second retreat, so this was in the later 80s, that let me get this right. The path of a certain types of yogic and specifically tantric visionary paths, and there I'm using visionary not in the sense of I see dead people, but these higher things we were talking about, employ sensory direct valid cognition, eventually leading to self-aware direct valid cognition, and finally yogic direct valid cognition. If I remember correctly, that's what he said. So there is some use of all four in the higher things. We must assert that there is certainly use of the first three in all higher paths, and must be at least concordant use of the fourth. a person who is engaged in the, who has achieved the verbal isolation and is cultivating mental isolation is asserted by Jogten Lodro Tai to be on the path of juncture. So, and I forget exactly where, he's more specific. If you look it up in the Treasury of Knowledge, it is a treasury of knowledge, it'll tell you that, tell you everything. How to make ink. So, therefore, they must be experiencing concordant yogic direct valid cognition and getting pretty close to true yogic direct valid cognition. Because of the methods employed, they must be experiencing sensory direct valid cognition because there are physical things being done, most dramatically if there's a concert involved, but even so, physical postures and so on. Certainly mental direct valid cognition and certainly self-aware. So I think it would be all four. And now where this gets tricky to discuss is in two specific approaches to the completion stage, which, as Kenshin Mipam wrote, achieve exactly the same result as the common completion stage of the 5 stages, but do so with, in one case, somewhat less difficulty, and that's the path of the Kala Chakra, or do so with much, much less difficulty and more efficiency, and that's the path of the higher reaches of Dzogchen. When you're talking about the Kala Chakra and Dzogchen unique paths, and they're not the same, but they have some similarities, then the issue of direct valid cognition becomes very important. Which doesn't mean that you need to study that stuff to do it, but scholars will,
Thank you.
You're welcome. We have time for one more. Peter?
I understand if you don't want to go into detail, but you did bring up your own experience in your becoming aware of your own dreaming. My question is the most skillful thing to do once you become aware that you're dreaming basically to supplicate your guru?
You have several choices. Supplication of your guru is always recommended under all circumstances. And if you can get in the habit of every time you return from unconsciousness to supplicate your guru with devotion, yes, that's excellent. At some point, if you want to do more things, you can turn yourself into deities, and you can travel to realms, which for some reason I always find very, very frightening, because I think I have such a scientific prejudice, not scientific knowledge, but scientific prejudice. I think, oh no, I'm going to get out in outer space, and I know I'm not in a physical body, but it's scary, and it's like the first time you go to the ocean as a kid after seeing Jaws. I was just not into the surf for a while after that. Those are the things. But a lot of it is dependent upon being motivated. So if your motivation is to supplicate your guru, then that's a good thing to do, and a very good habit to cultivate. But what I was talking about was just when I'm still not absolutely sure, but I suspect, The funny thing about dreaming and lucid dreaming is that you can have the most outlandish dreams that are totally impossible, with people turning into other people. And, I always often dream of dead relatives, and they're usually yelling at me or at least scolding me for something, I don't know what. And you'd think you'd know, right? And yet, the outlandish dreams, I don't. It's the ones that are slightly improbable. If it's impossible, I just swallow it, hook, line, and sinker. But, it's slightly improbable. And in the Shangpa tradition, they talk about the two occasions or opportunities for lucidity, Gyamtso and Zubzin. Gyamtso, or gentle lucidity, is when you typically something will be too good to be true. In one of the Shangpa masters in the 12th century, in his autobiography, writes about how there was a pair of boots that someone had made in the village he lived in. He didn't have boots. And he really, in Tibet, you need footwear. But he didn't have any. And he really wanted his parents to negotiate a deal and get him those boots. And he dreamed that they got him the boots. And he said, this is too good to be true. I know my parents are not going to buy me those boots. I must be dreaming. And he was. And that was how he began. Another way that works for another type of person. So if you're somebody who is suspicious of anything too good to be true, that might be a gate to lucidity. Another way is Zubzin, is a rough lucidity. And that's when you become so terrified in a dream that you suspect the unreality of what's terrifying you. Many people experience their first lucidity that way. But the key points to lucidity are, more important than any fancy techniques are two things. The first is that throughout the day, you either say to yourself, I'm dreaming, I'm dreaming, I'm dreaming, or you say, is this a dream? This could be a dream. That you learn to question reality. And because then the habit of that will, when you're dreaming, you'll say, is this a dream? Now, if you're stupid like me, you'll say, is this a dream? No, it's not a dream. I don't need to test things. If it's an impossible thing, like, my mother, who's been dead for 45 years, turns into a green dragon and starts yelling at me about something. I won't question that. I say, no, I'm not dreaming. This stuff just happens. And then the other key point to dreaming, to lucid dreaming, is to be motivated. If you kind of think, well, it would be nice, but I don't really care, and not that much, and I don't want it to get in the way of my sleep, it's not going to happen. Unless you really don't want it to happen, then it might happen. But if you really want lucid dreaming and you question reality throughout the day, that will help. That being said, Khenpo Tsotrim Gyamtso, whom I quoted earlier, made the point that it varies a great deal by individual. Some people just lucid dream naturally, without effort, without any even learning the name. And other people can do 3-year retreats and dream yoga until they're sick of the word and nothing. And in one of his writings, Longchenpa points out the different types of dream habits or tendencies and how difficult they are to purify. And I think he says, I may get this wrong, but if you dream about the present, like things you're doing currently or your day-to-day stuff, you're probably less deluded in the dream state, and it might be easier to gain lucidity and recognition and so on. If you dream about the past, generally, then it's you're a little more deluded. And if your dreams are a mishmash of past and present, like mine are, then you're going to have a hard time because you're pretty out of it same state. Okay, well, we should stop now, and we'll dedicate the merit with just the one stanza on page 7, and then this afternoon we'll use the full dedication. Sunam diye tamje zikpa nye tomne nyebe ranam pamje ne che ga nache balap chupa ye sibe zole drowa drowa. Thank you. Are we eating out or eating in? Out?